All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa, and let there be light in the Stoa. Feel free to turn on your camera. And today we have a special guest. We have Benjamin Watts with us, or otherwise known as Caveat Magister. And Benjamin wrote this really cool book, Turn Your Life into Art, Lessons in Psychomagic from the San Francisco Underground. And I have it right here. I'm quite enjoying it. And a blurb from the book, over 30 years, San Francisco's underground art scene developed techniques to create magical, impossible, life-changing experiences. Today, big corporations are trying to figure out how to spend millions of dollars to do what these artists and anti-artists did for nothing but time, space, and imagination. It was a movement without a manifesto. Right up the Stoa's alley, as you know, for those of you following the Stoa. And one of the themes and interests I have is what Pierre Hadot called artists of life, which he thought the original philosophers were, and he contrasts that with modern academic philosophers of artists of reason. And there's something about like blurring the lines between art and reality, which I think this book gets at quite nicely. So how today's going to work, I'm going to tag in Benjamin. He can introduce himself further if you'd like, and he'll present a little bit about the book and Psychomagic, and then him and I will have an exchange. And if you have any questions, pop in the chat, and I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself, and you can ask your question to Benjamin. And this will be on YouTube, so if you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that in the chat, and I can read your question on your behalf. So that being said, Benjamin, welcome to Stoa, and I'll tag you in, and feel free to jump in. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and I will endeavor to use Zoom properly. So I've been asked to say a few words about psychomagic and to talk a bit about it in ways that might particularly appeal to the Stoa and its interests. And let's first start by just talking about what psychomagic is in the first place, and then we'll talk about what I call psychomagic and society, which is the last section in Turn Your Life into Art, and talk sort of about some of the larger implications of this. Psychomagic as a term was coined by Alejandro Jodorowsky. I cannot take credit for it. It's his term. And I found it, and the sort of the loose concept behind it, to be the most applicable to what I was seeing in the San Francisco art underground, which, as the book says, over a period of about 30 years, did something that I think is unique and unprecedented with psychomagic, and that is very relevant for the issues we face today. But first, let's sort of talk about it generally. Jodorowsky's sense of psychomagic, and I'm mostly being faithful to his approach here, but adapting it a bit, is that much of who we are in our lives goes underneath our conscious selves. It happens below our conscious selves and our conscious minds at a deeper level. We are not aware of it, and yet it is important and it affects us. And you can take this as literally or metaphysically as you like. At a very literal, physical, materialist level, your neurons are firing in your brain. New synaptic pathways are being formed. You have no conscious awareness of this at all, but obviously it has a significant impact on how you live your life and how you perceive and engage in the world. The same thing with, the way your cells divide, blood moves through your systems, your organs function at a very physical, material level. Much of what is important about us and much of what affects us in our lives is happening at a level that we are not consciously aware of. The same thing occurs psychologically. We have unconscious biases. They affect us. We are not aware of them. We have framing. We have projections that we move out into the world, and cognitive schema. All of this is real and happens and affects us. But again, we're not consciously aware of it. And then if you want to take this to a metaphysical level, we have spirit and soul, which are very important to us, but not something that we can consciously have awareness of or work with. So all of these things are really important. And Jodorowsky's key insight is that when we are trying to do things like make changes in our lives, we tend to try to use the language of our conscious selves and apply it to our unconscious selves. That is to say, we try to make changes in a way that we as conscious beings understand clearly and simply. And the problem is that what has to change is often those things that are happening in our unconscious, as our schemas, our projections, our unacknowledged biases. And yet those parts of the unconscious don't speak the language of our conscious selves and our conscious minds. They speak the language that they don't speak spreadsheet. They don't speak logical argument. They don't speak reasonable discussion. They do speak the language of archetypes and myth, of magic and art and symbolism and poetry and action. And so Jodorowsky's key insight is that if we want to engage our unconscious selves, if we want to harness them for these purposes, we have to speak the languages that they understand. And those languages, those practices are psychomagic. And psychomagic is not unique to any one culture or place. In fact, you will find it, I would imagine, in every culture and every period on Earth. What's distinct and different, however, is that in virtually all of those cases, psychomagic was clearly linked with specific spiritual practices. That is to say, you had psychomagic that occurred when you went into cathedrals, when you engaged in religious rituals, when you engaged in particular practices that had their own worldview that were attached to them. You had to buy into the worldview in order to gain access to the practices that access the psychomagic. What San Francisco was doing in this period of time was creating psychomagical experiences and a whole psychomagical culture that had no such requirements. That is to say that you did not have to buy into any pre-established worldview or set of beliefs in order to participate in it. The experience itself was everything and carried that through. And I think that is not only unique in and of itself in world history, but also they took this to a much larger extent than anyone has before with this kind of thing. They created a underground culture that was in so many ways a series of ritual practices and psychomagical practices that had no barriers to entry and anyone could participate in, and that therefore allowed much greater inclusivity and allowed for people from different perspectives to encounter one another there, have shared experiences, and I think was significant and not yet fully understood or appreciated. And this has ramifications for the broader society as well, not just the individual. And that's what I'm going to talk about briefly now, if we have a sense of what psychomagic sort of is generally and how it functions. When we look at this socially, art changes lives because it tends to raise the question, how should we live? Sometimes it does that in an overt and intellectual way. Political agitprop is nothing if not blatant. Sometimes it does that by making us feel things we don't understand but are compelled by, and inviting us to follow those feelings to see where they lead. In his book, The Use and Abuse of Art, historian Jacques Barzoun suggests that it is better not to talk about art with a capital A and instead to talk about the arts, all lowercase, because in fact, there are many different kinds of art and they all work in different ways and do different things. I've long thought that this is probably the better approach, or at least the more useful one for most conversations. But while art with a capital A may not be a real thing, it is a real concept that we have had since at least the period of German idealism, and it has only become more important over time. Barzoun was one of many thinkers, Susie Gablik, Philip Rieff, and Camille Paglia, or others, who believed that modernity created art with a capital A because it needed an acceptable substitute for God. Much of society has secularized, but human nature hasn't changed, and so the functions performed by religion are still needed. The two places we have ended up putting most of those functions are art and therapy. Artists and therapists are now supposed to be the people who tend to our need for meaning, who hear our confessions, and who offer a sense of transcendence in the world. Together, they are supposed to be able to cover all of that holy ground for those who hold nothing sacred. But art and therapy are not religion. Even if they can do the job adequately, and I'm not at all convinced that they can, they're going to do it differently. Different dynamics will emerge. The idea that you could simply slide religion out and put art and therapy in its place and have nothing change is misguided. I don't think secular culture has really reckoned with that dynamic. Nevertheless, this is in many ways what San Francisco's psychomagical scene was attempting to do. And is it a coincidence that many of the most early and influential figures in what would become the psychomagical experience scene were atheists who were fascinated by art and psychology and looking for ways to break out of their own sense of isolation and connect more deeply, both with others and with something larger? I don't think so. Viewed from this perspective, it's easy, perhaps too easy, to think of psychomagic as the kind of art that fills the gap in secular society left by religion. Or if you're a more spiritual person, to think of psychomagic as a spiritual discipline, which is often exactly what it feels like anyway, frankly. It really can. Susie Gablick believed that the next major movement in art would be an explicit connection of the spiritual and the material, the transcendent and the immanent. Writing in her book, Has Modernism Failed? Trying to make meaningful art in a society that doesn't believe in anything requires breaking down the rigidity of specialization, the segregation of functions and activities, both within the personality and within the community as a whole. It means reintroducing the artist in his role as shaman, a mystical, priestly, and political figure in prehistoric cultures, who, after coming close to death through accident or severe illness, becomes a visionary and a healer. The shaman's function is to balance and center society, integrating many planes of life experience and defining the culture's relationship to the cosmos. When these various domains, the human and divine, fall out of balance, it is the shaman's responsibility to restore the lost harmony and reestablish equilibrium. Only an individual who successfully masters his actions in both realms is a master shaman. Now, I prefer not to use the term art shaman or psychomagical shaman for what we're talking about, because I find that when white people use the word shaman, it attracts a whole bunch of other white people who really want to talk about the kinds of shamans they are. And within 5 minutes, I'm being offered a somatic vision quest by a kid with dreadlocks and a trust fund, and I regret having ever opened my mouth. So psychomagical artist is still my preferred term until something better comes along. And maybe that's for the best. It's more humble and so less an attractor of bullshit. But you can see Gablick's point though, right? If we have an art form that is at its best when it is tailored to specific people and is able to bring a sense of meaning and authenticity and is able to connect that to a feeling of transcendence, that is able to heal psychological wounds and provide guidance through life, and is most potently practiced by people who are taking the profit motive out of it, then in a culture that is looking for spiritual substitutes, there's an obvious role for it to play here, or one that used to be played almost exclusively by priests and now is often played by therapists. That just makes sense, right? It does, and I've always been suspicious of that. Having talked about the potential of this now, I want to pull that back a bit. Among informal circles of the psychomagical practitioners, well, first of all, when we talk about turning our life into art, we have to recognize that anything that you practice enough changes the way you view the world. If you spend a lot of time training to be a trapeze artist, then your relationship with gravity changes. If you spend a lot of time driving race cars, then your relationship with fast-moving objects change and ordinary traffic patterns change. And similarly, if you spend a lot of time practicing working with the unconsciouses of others and your own unconscious in an artistic way, it is going to change your relationship to your own unconscious, which is a big deal. And in fact, I once had a joke with a artist in the Bay Area who does this kind of thing named Robin Zero, that if we were to ever have a collected group of all the psychomagical artists we really respect, we would call it the San Francisco Life Ruiners Guild, not because we were ruining other people's lives, because in many ways we were ruining our own. But we do that, such a group, a San Francisco Life Ruiners Guild, does serve these roles for one another of artist, of priest, of healer. I have been asked to create experiences to help people with their grief for lost loved ones and their suicidal ideations and their communal struggles, as well as for fun and celebration. And I have in turn received that support, and it's worked, and I've been profoundly grateful. Communal events and personal milestones are likewise marked with new psychomagical rituals for bachelor parties, for weddings. We are in so many ways, or at least we used to be, like a religious congregation made up entirely of priests who can never do the same ritual twice, and so have to create new ones for every occasion. And it's amazing. And so, yes, there is a way in which it works exactly the way Gablick is talking about. But it's also way too easy to romanticize. Remember that a lot of these people are all but starving artists crashing in corners of America's most superheated real estate market. In practical terms, rent control is our higher power. And for all that we're talking about creating the conditions for things that feel miraculous to occur, it's not like any of us have superpowers. We don't, and we all know it. A lot of us don't even have our lives together, not even close. And yet Susie Gablick wants us to restore the lost harmony and balance the equilibrium of our culture? Us? I mean, honestly, it makes me wonder if she's ever actually met any artists who are doing what she wants us to do. But beyond the fact that I think it's easy to take this entirely too seriously, I think there are also important reasons why psychomagical art is very potent and very powerful for us personally, but less than ideal to carry the weight of our culture upon its shoulders. And the first one is that it doesn't really seem to scale. In fact, the longer I've spent in scenes like this, the more suspicious I become about the idea of scaling up. I still have not yet seen any evidence that it is possible for psychomagic to truly scale. It can get bigger. It can get, 80,000 people in the Burning Man, and be the psychomagical capital of the world for that time. But I don't think it scales. And without that, the kind of social change Gablik envisions can't be achieved by artists alone. Society should not put that on us, and we should not put that on ourselves. Psychomagic gets less effective when you are trying to scale it. It gets less effective when you are trying to use it for marketing and branding, and there are all kinds of reasons for that. And it also gets less effective when you use it to try to save the world. The whole point of psychomagic is that you're opening the door to whatever comes next, to what emerges out of the participants' unconscious. Saving the world may be an altruistic agenda, but it's still an agenda layered on top of the experience you're creating, which will quickly lead to diminishing returns. If you start to say, oh no, your unconscious can't want to go there because that's not saving the world, then suddenly the whole thing doesn't work. The whole experience falls apart. It may be interesting and cool, but it's not going to be psychomagical. And honestly, I mean, I do wish that a league of psychomagical artists could form a priestly class whose wisdom and prowess would lead us to a better future as we shape the psyches of our communities. But then I get over myself. People who are really good at one thing always assume that they should be in charge. Psychomagic surely has a role to play in art and culture, but it's not a panacea or a shortcut. It's an amazing thing that can change lives and support communities, but then the work still has to be done. Put another way, psychomagic can change the world, but not save it. But that's just like everything else. Literacy changed the world, but didn't save it. Computers changed the world, but didn't save it. Democracy changed the world, but didn't save it. And all of these things are at their most impactful when they are at their most accessible. They do what they do best when everyone has access. The only reason to keep people from having access to literacy and computers and democracy and understanding how they work is if you want to hold something over them. Much like literacy, psychomagic has enriched my life so profoundly that I can't imagine who I would be without it. Like computers, psychomagic has made my life far more complicated than it might otherwise be, in ways good and bad. Like democracy, I am frequently terrified of where psychomagic might take me. But what sets psychomagic apart is that it is also anti-utilitarian. It resists being done for any reason other than to be done for its own sake. It can be yoked to another purpose, but the tighter you bind them together, the less effective the whole thing becomes. Which brings us back to you. Inevitably, always back to you. Here we have this thing, this kind of experience, present in so many places and cultures, but brought to a particular height and shine in a remarkable underground scene in late 20th and early 21st century San Francisco. It's now on the decline again because it is hard to hold on to, which makes it more like democracy than literacy or computers. It costs no money, but if you try to do it halfway, you're not really doing it at all. It will offer you some of the greatest experiences of your life, but it will change your life in ways that you can't imagine. And while it can have a profoundly valuable place in society, it cannot be scaled. It cannot be automated. And for all your good intentions, it will often not go where you tell it to go or do what you tell it to do. That's what it is. And the question for you personally then becomes, given all this, do you want to tap into it? Do you want to turn your life into art? And let's stop there and see what reactions we have, see where we want to go from here.
Awesome. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you for that, Benjamin. And feel free to pop some questions in the chat, and you can ask it to Benjamin, and I'll warm up the stove with some questions of my own. So one of the themes, like I totally got ritual pilled, as I like to call it, by reading Byung-Chul Han's book, Disappearance of Rituals. And I was like, oh man, yeah, this is one of the reasons for this kind of like the meaning crisis, or, the state of meaninglessness a lot of people feel these days. And so we've been having a lot of sessions on ritual, and we even actually had like our resident ritual artist, Rebecca Fox, which is cool. And Jonathan Harris, he's an artist, and he does this concept called life art, which I think maps over somewhat to Psychomagic. And he breaks down ritual into three parts: routine, ceremony, and spell. So routine builds character that anchors you in life. So for example, going to the gym. Ceremony creates communion or communitas and connecting with life. So like Burning Man would be an example. And the spell invokes catharsis and transforms life. And that's what he referred to as a life art. And so I'm curious, like how like psychomagic, it seems like the psychomagic, could like weave between the first two of those things, or the last two, the ceremony and spell. But I'm curious how psychomagic relates to ritual in that sense of how like I just presented it and how maybe it's commonly known. Then I have a few follow-up questions with that.
So there are certain kinds of ritual that I would say are designed to create psychomagic, and certain kinds that are not. The fundamental question, I think, is the ritual attempting to take you someplace unfamiliar, or is it attempting to ground you and return you to the familiar? The psychomagical effect happens when you convince a part of someone's psyche that normally doesn't come out to play, or normally doesn't engage, or is stuck in some way, that there is something here that it can do, that there is something useful that it can participate in, or simply some way that it wants to engage. It is compelled. And so that feeling often of awe, of wonder, or that sense that something is different in the world that you weren't expecting, that the world is different than the way you thought it is in many ways at the heart of the psychomagical experience. Suddenly something that was not possible before is possible now. And when you have rituals that are designed to evoke that, then you are talking about psychomagical rituals. On the other hand, when you are talking about rituals that are designed to comfort and make you say, oh yes, the world is exactly what I think it is, we are returning to routine, everything is coming back to normal, I would say that is not a psychomagical effect. If anything, that goes in the other direction. Psychomagic, especially at its most effective, but in general, tends to take you unpredictable places. You don't know where you are going to end up when you start to unleash these forces. When you are starting to say, okay, we're inviting something out that doesn't usually come out. It has its own agenda, and you're not setting it. You're not telling it, oh, and you're going to go here and here and here and here. This is why branding and marketing efforts can be very interesting experiences, but tend to fail as psychomagic, because they're not actually interested in what's really coming out of you. They're interested in making a point, in building their brand, and whatever is happening in your head is much less important than their brand guidelines. And so, they're always going to steer you back to the mean. Psychomagic is designed to get you away from that. So I think that's sort of its relationship with ritual. Some rituals can be very, very potent for evoking that. Some are in fact designed to do just the opposite.
And so Rebecca Fox, she calls herself a ritual artist, and she had a series here, and she has this little like practice where people go in with an issue, something that they feel stuck or bothered by, and then she like creates this bespoke ritual, and then they engage it, and it's like pretty epic. And I've done a few with her, and they're quite beautiful. And so she contrasts the ritual artist with like being like a ritual designer, the thing that's popular and more in the corporate context. And even though they make some of the same moves, but like one's intrinsic and the other is instrumental, I would say. And like the artist is like, the daemon or the daimon channels through you, and you don't know where it's going to lead. And so I think like viewing these both as skills, I find helpful, because, okay, you can be skilled as an artist, and there's a way to go about it. And then skilled as a designer, and there's a way to go about it. Same moves, but the mindset's radically different. And so I've been talking to Rebecca about like cultivating a ritual agency, to have this capacity to be good at ritual artistry or maybe ritual design. And I know that's been a benefit from my life, engaging in. I'm just like designing all these bespoke rituals, and it's like making my world more enchanted. And so when it comes to the maybe the word scale is the wrong word here, but when it comes to like helping people with this skill set so they have the agency to do it themselves. Do you think there's a place for that to just teach it and demystify it a little bit? Maybe demystify is the wrong word here too, but I'm curious what you think of that.
No, I agree completely. This let's take Burning Man as an example here, because I think there's a useful example there. Every year, Black Rock City becomes the global capital of psychomagic. That's where it happens more than any place. And one of the key decisions that Burning Man as an organization and as a culture made in its formative period is that it did not end up turning its artists into a priestly caste. That is to say, it did not say, come and these people will do the amazing thing that you'll get to participate in. It said, this is a participatory culture. It's a democracy. You can do it too. And that made a significant difference in what kind of culture emerged. On the one hand, it means that while, yes, you have these amazing artists sort of coming and going, a lot of people get really good at doing psychomagic in Burning Man environments and then move on to other environments. That's a way in which, because you don't enshrine your great practitioners as a priestly caste who have all kinds of privileges and extra honors and power, they leave, they go to other things. On the other hand, while you have that loss, you have a culture that says, oh yes, we're all doing this. Anyone can do this. Do you want to do this? You can engage. And that means that not only does everyone have more access, but you have a much greater psychomagical environment and you have much more of it, and everybody gets better at it, though not everyone is as good at it. And those kinds of things are the truly transformational elements. So this is what I was talking about before with literacy, for example. You don't get the same culture when you have a priestly caste and they say, we're the literate ones and we decide what the good books are and what's relevant to read and how this is going to work. And there's certain advantages to that. You don't get nearly as much spam, nearly as much mediocre crap coming at you. But on the other hand, when you have a culture where everyone is literate, suddenly you have so much more possibility, and suddenly the written word has so much more power to engage, and you have I think a much better environment, even if the skill of reading no longer gets a few people the same level of really exceptional people, the same level of perks and engagement. I think it is not only possible to spread this knowledge out, these techniques out, and talk about them openly, but I think it's kind of essential. I think that's where the real benefit comes in. That is very much the world that I would prefer to live in. And I don't think you are going to de-enchant the world this way or further disenchant the world this way, precisely because there's a level at which it doesn't scale. You can teach the techniques to everyone, the teaching of these things in a sort of a rote way. Yeah, that can be done. I published a book on it, for crying out loud. There's an audio book. You can learn about these techniques while you are driving to and from work. But the actual practice of it involves reaching specific people's psyches and going where they tell you to go. And so that becomes a very intensely personal process. And I think that's going to remain an intensely personal process when it is effective. So there's a way in which I'm not worried about, corporate marketing executives taking over psychomagic and, making it all planned and marketed and sold out, because it doesn't work that way. If they're welcome to do it, but if they're going to do it at that level, they're going to need to follow where the psyches of the people they're actually reaching go, and that's never going to be on brand. It's going to be idiosyncratic. It's going to be weird. It's going to be intensely personal, and it's never going to be on brand or where it's supposed to go. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it feels like at least one of the cruxes there is the intention. If the people in the corporate world want to use it for something other than what it wants from you, then it's not going to work. And so it has to have this wildness, demonic wildness with it. And I haven't finished the book. I'm a quarter through it, and so you might have addressed it in it. But I'm curious about this. Taking a different perspective rather than the materialist worldview that a lot of people in this culture are situated in. And Jack Hunter, he came to the Stoics, an anthropologist or para-anthropologist, and he has this term ontological flooding, where instead of if an anthropologist goes into a certain kind of a community and culture, instead of like bracket it with their like Western worldview, they just dive into it and not just like analyze it, but believe what the people are believing, and so their body gets flooded, their ontology gets flooded, and it seems like that's an aspect of psychomagic, like being promiscuous with how you see reality in order to cultivate a certain state. And so I'm curious how that lands for you, and if you have any shares there.
Yeah, like I said in my introduction, one of the unique things about the San Francisco School of Psychomagic, if we can call it that, is that it requires no preset ontology. You can come in with pretty much any beliefs you have. It is the only form of psychomagic, certainly the only form of highly developed psychomagic that I'm familiar with, that doesn't have any preset beliefs that you have to come in on. And I think that is crucially important, a vital distinction. It also very much informs how I like to look at these questions and talk about these questions. I actually am not at all interested in talking about either the metaphysics or the physicality of psychomagic, of whether it is there are materialistic explanations for it, or you need to go to spiritual explanations. I'm entirely interested in the phenomenological questions. What kind of experience are you having? How does it make you feel? Where does it go with that? Those kinds of questions are what I'm much more interested in, not only as a practitioner whose interest is in having people have these kinds of experiences, but because I find the conversations are much more interesting. That when I am talking to people about a psychomagical experience or the concept of psychomagic, the minute they say, "Oh, well, let's figure out what's really going on. Let's talk about brain function here, or let's talk about metaphysics and spirit and soul," the conversation gets into an argumentative, uninteresting place. It falls into this rut that doesn't really go anywhere, and everyone leaves frustrated, and no one is any further ahead than when they started. But when we are talking about your experience, what are you experiencing? How does this make you feel? Where does this take you? Suddenly it can go really interesting places. And even if we never settle the ontological or metaphysical questions, we've gone to a much deeper, more productive place. And so those are the conversations that I prefer to have about this. I'm happy for people to debate the metaphysics or the materiality of all of this, but if I'm involved in the conversation, I want it to be phenomenological, because for me, that's where all the productive stuff is.
Very cool. And I have a few more questions, but we'll take in David. David, you had a question.
Understand the anti-utilitarian aspect a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
More detail about what
your mic was cutting in and out.
Understand maybe more details on the anti-utilitarian aspect, like what coming into that will not block it from working.
Sure. So there are a couple of different approaches to this. It's not just one answer. The sort of philosophical answer is that we have what Burning Man's founder Larry Harvey would call unconditional values, things that we simply value for their own sake. Why do we laugh? Why do we care about laughing? Why do we care about love? Why do we care about these kinds of things? Well, they're things that we value for their own sake, not because they are useful in taking us to something else, but there are certain kinds of experiences in life that we just value for their own sake, and therefore we pursue them. We can't necessarily monetize them, but that's okay, because God damn it, we actually care whether or not all of our other needs are met. We're still going to want to do these things. I think for many of us, certainly for me, psychomagic experiences fit into that category. They are something that I love doing for its own sake. And even when everything else is working fine and is on track, I still yearn for those kinds of experiences. So one answer would be that psychomagical experiences are things that we value unconditionally. But there's also a way in which psychomagical experiences, well, first of all, they can be just tremendously interesting in and of themselves. Some of the weirdest, most amazing experiences that I have had fall into this category. And so we can simply do it because we see someone doing something wondrous and weird and want to know what that is, and can we participate? And sure, that's another aspect of it. We're simply following the wonder, or following the shiny, or following the sense of awe. But let me come back as well to this notion that I was saying before, that a lot of the San Francisco psychomagical techniques were developed by people who were fascinated by therapy and by the experimental therapeutic techniques that were being developed as part of the humanistic and transpersonal and existential psychological movements, all of which were actually being developed often in the San Francisco Bay Area around the same time period. So there is, I think, considerable overlap here. And I think a lot of people engage in these experiences because there is a yearning that they are trying to figure out, because there is a wound that they are trying to look at or heal or address. Like I say, I've been privileged to have someone come to me and say, I lost someone some years ago and I can't get over their memory, and can we do something around this? Can we design an experience around this? And there is a utilitarian aspect in that, and its therapeutic aspect, but it's not utilitarian in the sense that in order for it to be effective, it has to then go wherever it goes. You can design the experience, but you can't design the outcome. And in fact, a key element of this is that you have to let go of control past a certain point. You set the conditions, but then you do not try to control where it's going to end up. And so, yes, we can do a psychomagical experience around this person's grief and sense of loss, but I can't promise that they're going to feel better after it. I can only promise that we're going to explore that. We're going to open something up, and we're going to see what comes out. And if I am very good at what I do, sure, I can sort of try to bend it towards catharsis, but I'm not in control. I'm channeling what happens, and I'm not making a utilitarian promise. I'm not saying that we have a mechanism whereby if you do this, then it will help. Then you will help your marriage. I can say, if you guys are having problems and you want to take this as a technique, we can explore that. We can bring the stuff up. But once it's up, it goes where it wants to go, and we have set the initial conditions, but then we're following. Does that make sense?
Yeah, to repeat back, I think what I'm hearing is it's okay to go in with an agenda, but not one where you're trying to control it, but more like you would like for this to happen, but it's also going to go its own way.
Yeah, you're conducting an experiment more than you are creating a product. You're saying let's create an experiment around these areas, these issues, these experiences you're having, and see what happens. And you can try to set the conditions to go well, and hopefully you do. But there's always this. One of the things I say over and over again about these experiences is that they're not benign. If you do this right, if you invoke psychomagic, it's not going to be benign. It's going to bring in very real stuff that has the potential to be dangerous, to have an impact. You can't design that out. You have to learn how to work with that and manage that. But so yeah, you're conducting an experiment. You're saying, let's see what happens. Let's go there. Let's try this, and let's do it in an artful and interesting way. And if we do it right, it will hopefully go well. But yeah, you're not setting out an agenda with an end goal whereby by the end of the process, this is how we will all feel.
Great. Makes sense. Thanks for clarifying that.
Absolutely.
Thanks, David. Kevin, you had a share or question.
Hello, Mr. Magister.
Hello.
I really enjoyed this presentation. I like what you're talking about. I think I agree with the psychomagic kind of stuff. It's exciting, it's dangerous, it's exploratory. It's like all the technologies have different forms of their own. Like right now we're over Zoom, and it's like we're on computers, and computers are totally, just like the app store or the internet, it's just like this big attention, economy of all these different fucking what you were saying. The magic shit. Anyways, I just wanted to say it's been awesome. And this whole time I've been making a hat, so I'll show you the hat.
Ah,
How's it look?
glow in the dark.
Oh shit! There we go. Ooh.
Awesome.
Yeah. This is a could do a play about this. I don't know. All right. Yeah, so I think there's an element of like play to it, you know. And I made this out of like arts and crafts thing, and it feels like
You're absolutely right. Actually, in the book I refer to the Holy Trinity of Psychomagic as being art, ritual, and play, and that not only are they the three individual elements that can get you there, but the more you are able to segue between them, the more you can turn your art into ritual, and your ritual into art, and your art into play, and your play into ritual, and your ritual into play, and the more you make that a seamless, porous boundary, the more likely you are to have a psychomagical effect. Absolutely. Yeah, no, it can be incredibly playful. And I've been talking about this, I was just using examples that were, very serious, okay, we're going to try addressing someone's grief, we're going to try helping someone's marriage, but a lot of it can just be stupidly playful too. Let's see what happens. There's an element in which the kink educator Midori has a definition of kink as being childlike play using adult sexual capacities, or something like that, something close to that. And I think there's something very much about psychomagic there too, that you can take these very serious things and you can address them playfully, or you can take these very playful things and then put all of your capacities into it. It's building a sandcastle, really building a sandcastle, with if you have architects doing that, then suddenly you've got a whole other level of it happening here. So yeah, no, play is an absolutely key element. It's part of the Holy Trinity of psychomagical experiences.
For sure. Thank you. Remember, you can't just build a castle out of sand, though. It's fun, though. Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. Antonia, you had a question?
Yeah, I like to hear, like, if I'm not Antonia, but I'd like to hear if you could give us an anecdote where you had, or not you, or whoever had like a reversal doing psychomagic, or something unexpected or funny happening, just so we could like get the sense of it in an example.
Sure. So the thing that first comes to mind is a year or so ago, this would have been 2021, I did a project called the Demon Garden, in which I created a garden of personal demons and set it up as sort of an outdoor museum tour that people could just wander through. And they were all different people. They were physical artistic embodiments of people's personal demons, and they all had names and descriptions, and even an audio tour to go with it. So people had a tablet, and if they wanted to learn more about a demon they were looking at as they wandered through, they could click on its name in the tablet and hear the person whose demon it was talking about this personal demon in their own words and their own voice, and how it had affected them and where it had come from and what it meant to them. And then after they had gone through that, I gave people the opportunity of creating their own personal demon and planting it in the garden, of reaching into their head, pulling a personal demon out and planting it in the garden through a ritual. And most of the time, this worked exactly the way it had been intended, but fairly often you would have people who knew that they had something that they needed to plant in the garden, but couldn't articulate what it was. And so they would discover it in the process of doing that. They would just, given art supplies, they would just start drawing something and then suddenly discover, oh, right, this is the thing that is the personification of this issue I've been struggling with. It's been haunting me all this time. And so there was often a sense of discovery and reversal in that. But then you had a few people, not many, but a few, who would start to do it and then just stop and not be able to. that they actually, a couple people had a meltdown while trying to do this, that whatever it is they were trying to reach, whatever it is that they were trying to access, it was too much for them, it was unacceptable to them, parts of their psyche weren't letting them, and so they actually would have a meltdown in that moment, and I would have, okay, let's talk this through, let's, so we're going, and several people never got there. Instead, what they got was, an hour of extra conversation with me in which we were sort of talking through what it meant that they couldn't do this, or calming them down from the fact that this had freaked them out in some way. And so yeah, absolutely, there is an example of it turning askew in a couple of cases, and having to be dealt with, having to be managed.
Yeah, thank you. That illustrates it in a great way. You like provide a specific context within which people sort of start playing and doing stuff, and then different things emerge.
Right. There was another project that I did, I think this would have been this was during the main part of the pandemic project, so this was in 2020, where for reasons that I don't really talk about, this was a project for me, but I was bringing people in to my backyard one at a time for an art experience. And this was in the height of the pandemic, so it was outdoors, we were distanced, but and I would talk them through. I gave it a bit of a ritual aspect, laid out some themes I would later come back to, and then told them an intensely personal story that of an issue that I was struggling with that sort of came to a head when someone had sent me a book. And the book itself wasn't offensive to me, but the context in which it had been sent to me was so infuriating that I had decided to burn it, but I wasn't able to, because the situation, the issues still had some kind of power over me. And so the essence of the experience was, I said, okay, and here's the book. Would you help me burn it? Would you help me do this right now? And so if they agreed, and everyone did, they would rip some pages out of the book, and we'd go back to some of the ritual elements I'd introduced before, and we would burn this together. And so I was enlisting my community to burn this book for me in order to help me get through some things. And what I hadn't seen coming up in this was that so many people would suddenly say, oh, well, this, tell me about an experience that they had with this. And suddenly it really was a personal thing for them too. There was a moment where one person, I'll never forget this, says, oh, well, let me tell you about the one book in my life I've destroyed. And it was this intense story that she had never really told many other people. And suddenly it was a communal experience that we were having now, because in burning my book, she was also going back to this experience that she had had. And so, yeah, there's another example. I'll make this quick and then we'll move on. That I don't talk about that one in the book, but I do talk about in the book a very strange experience that I had at a underground party that took place in a sort of a park area that people had set up various musical stations in, and we were all wandering around it late at night. And some people had wanted to do an activity with me, but we had gotten separated, and it was a no cell phones event, and we couldn't find each other. And so in order to try to find me, they gathered around a piano, and one of them said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to play Leonard Cohen's Alleluia, and we're going to sing it, and Caveat will show up. He will just appear. And she said this because there was some context in which I had performed the song at a friend's funeral recently, or memorial service. And so they started playing it, and I was way on the other side of the garden, and just suddenly heard this and just had this overwhelming impulse that I need to go there now. And it was a very strange thing, but nobody, that was the intention. It was set up, but the way in which it actually occurred was something that nobody could expect. And when I showed up, things went in a weird direction, and it was all quite wonderful. But yeah, it was a very sort of playful summoning ritual that actually worked exactly as intended. And yet we still didn't see what came next.
Very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a fun story. That was in the book. David, you had another question, and then we'll wrap up after.
Okay. Yeah, I believe you mentioned something about that psychomagic might be missing something, kind of untethered from a structured worldview or perhaps religion. Maybe I misunderstood. That's kind of what I heard. And I was wondering if you could talk more about what you think might be missing there from psychomagic that would be cool to try adding to it.
Well, it's not so much that I think that something is missing from it as that I prefer to have a very humble take on what it's capable of and what its capacity is. I have I live in San Francisco, which is, part of the Silicon Valley culture, and at this point, which is full of utopians who believe that we are just the one step away from doing the thing. If we can just get the program, then the AI will save us. If we can just, get the technology, the app will save us. If we can just do the yoga pose, then everything will be fine. And so I've heard a lot of similar claims made for every artistic movement that I have encountered, and certainly this kind of thing, that if we just get more people to do this, then everything will work. And I want to be more humble than that, just generally, but also I think that psychomagical experiences can be very important to culture, but I think they can only be culture bearing up to a certain point, especially because they are so oriented around, at least in the San Francisco approach. We're talking again about the San Francisco style of psychomagic here, about unlocking what's going on in the individual psyche and connecting the individual to their own sense of larger purpose, of healing, of wonder, of awe. And the more the society tries to say, no, but this is what we do, this is how you orient, and put that in the psychomagic, the less effective it is going to be. And so I think that for things like cultural interdictions, for shared cultural practices, I think those things, we can develop things like that are encouraging of psychomagical experiences, but I don't think the psychomagical experiences themselves are going to be the same kinds of cultural building blocks that we would look to religion to be. Or that's my sense of it, that to the extent that psychomagic can build a culture, at least the San Francisco approach to it, I'm interested in seeing what people try, but I am not going to be the one who goes out there and says, oh, this is the answer, to our problems, any more than any other one particular part of it. I think that's it. It's less about my understanding of psychomagic and more about my understanding of what it takes to build a culture, and a healthy one at that.
Okay, got it. Have you seen attempts then at bringing San Francisco style psychomagic together with something more like religion?
I think in some ways the biggest example of that is Burning Man, which is not a religion per se, but is a larger culture, a global culture that is in many ways designed around developing psychomagical practices. I think in some ways, in 2019, I published a book through North Atlantic Press called The Scene That Became Cities, which is about Burning Man's philosophy and how it builds communities. And then in 2021, the Burning Man organization actually published Turn Your Life into Art, which is the book we're talking about now. And I've often felt like those books actually came out in reverse order, that Turn Your Life into Art is about how you and I develop these individual practices in our own lives and turn our lives into art. And then The Scene That Became Cities is about what a culture that is grounded in this might look like, one of the ways it could develop. But so I think that my answer to that question would be actually this other book, The Scene That Became Cities. But what you would see is a culture that is grounded in the immediacy of experience, in valuing radical self-expression, in valuing gifts and decommodified experiences. I think a culture that is grounded in psychomagic would have a deep appreciation for decommodified experiences, precisely because psychomagic is so hard to commodify. So I think those are sort of the directions we'd be looking at. And it, like I say, it can work up to a point. Certainly, it is possible. It's just, I think I think that once you start to do it, you still have to answer other questions. Psychomagic will not do it by itself. You're not going to be able to say psychomagic and then stop doing the hard work of culture building. You're still going to have to build culture around it. It's just that you'll have this additional element in it. You'll have this other tool in your toolkit.
Cool. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thanks, David. So we'll gently close here. Benjamin, any parting words you'd like to leave us with here at the Stoa, or anyone watching?
Yeah, I would say that this idea of turning your life into art, this idea of engaging in art experiments in your daily life, by yourself, with others, it has profoundly changed my life for the better, but it has not made it less complicated. It has brought me immense joy and also stress and struggle. I recommend it highly. I'm not sure in some ways what else life is for, other than creating art and creating community and seeking these experiences of awe and wonder that come when you engage in art experiments. So I recommend it. I think it's wonderful. I'm hoping to open a door that people can walk through. What I would just say is that you don't have to start at zero. That, I wrote the book precisely because there's a whole subculture that was developing these techniques that, you can start small and start with what people have done before and move into your own practice from there. So there's plenty you can do with it, but it's a journey that is so worth taking.
Awesome. And do check out the book. I'm quite enjoying it. Turn Your Life into Art. Here's a book on the chat, which I'll include in the show notes. And then you can support Benjamin on his Patreon account. And so I'll make some closing announcements of upcoming events in a moment. But Benjamin, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today. It was a treat to have you here. And if you like this session, we got one coming up. It's quite jazzy. Mythopoetic Cognition is the Engine of the Mind, Somatic Meditation, and the Imaginal with River Kina. I'm digging this somatic meditation. It seems quite embodied tech. And then the other session that just got posted, Post-Authenticity, Profilicity, and Genuine Pretending by Hans Georg Muller. This concept of genuine pretending, I'm really digging. So you can check that one out. All events can be RSVP'd at thestoa.ca. That being said, Benjamin, everyone, thank you so much for coming to Stoa today.